So I'm recording. Okay. So again, welcome to 201, and let me now share the syllabus. Okay, can everyone see it? And can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay, so this is 201. We're going to meet from 1 to 4, but like we said, 120, 110 to 115 is fine. And then we'll try to end before 4 o'clock. Okay, so our goals: to understand macro variables such as GDP and inflation, with especially a focus in the Philippine context. So if you notice, we have Gregory Mankiw here. You can use 10th edition. For one, I'm primarily using the 7th edition text. I've checked yung contents, and in terms of the theories and the principles, the concepts, they're pretty much the same because this consensus has been around for a while. The macro consensus on how to model it, except for the really cutting edge stuff. We're just gonna discuss a little bit, but not yet talk about. Okay, so we're gonna use Mankiw as sort of the foundation on the theory and the concepts, but as much as possible, pupunta tayo sa Philippine context. And there's a lot of research on Philippine macroeconomics that would really be interesting, and I'd want everyone to be knowledgeable about before they graduate. So we'll be doing a lot of like journal reading and connecting that to the basic Mankiw theory. Next, to understand theories and policy relating different macro variables. So that's the whole point of using Mankiw, is to get that basic workhorse model ng macroeconomics. Okay, so we will look at the role of government in setting macro policy, monetary and fiscal policy. To understand economic growth. So sometimes economic growth is labeled as, especially in a developing country context, economic development. In this course, we will essentially do like a big overview of the main models for economic growth, which you will also see in much more depth and detail in a development economics course. But we'll try to understand the growth, determinants of growth, and how to test for the different hypotheses that come out of these growth models. And finally, to read and consume research on Philippine macroeconomic performance. And okay, so I've collected, because of the wide breadth and scope ng macro, there's lots of things to talk about. We won't have time between now and the end of the year. So what's going to happen is I collected a few papers that I'd like everyone to read, and papers that we will discuss throughout the year. And we will definitely read and consume these things, right? And for this particular today, and for like tomorrow, not tomorrow, next week, we'll especially be talking about chain weight GDP. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive in chain weight GDP, looking at the champion of chain weight GDP sa Pilipinas is an economist named Jesus Dumagan. Just to jump to the chase, he has been advocating for this since the early 2000s. Unfortunately, or I don't know if, again, this is something we can talk about. What is the value of chain weight GDP? Why do we want it? And if we did move to a chain weight measure of GDP and GDP growth, ano yung magigain natin doon, right? So we will be talking really about chain weight GDP next week. And I'll show you the paper exactly. Okay, wait, actually I can just bring that up right now. He wrote this paper while he was still in PIDS. And he was in PIDS from most of the 2000s. until fairly recently. Lumipat na siya sa Lasal. Okay, so the texts are Macroeconomics by N. Gregory Mankiw, 10th edition or earlier. Again, I am using the 7th edition. And then other texts to be assigned, which we will talk about briefly in a moment. So what is our assessment? So we've got midterm and a final. And nakaschedule na siya dito. We probably will not finish 1, 2, 3. So yung mangyayari is we'll try to follow this as much as possible. But if not, we'll just move to the next week kung ano yung hindi natin natapos and so on and so forth. However, yeah, that's going to be the policy until the midterm. So the midterm will be on this date, and hopefully we'll tackle all of these different topics. Most confident na kaya natin gawin. Like, the things that we will not finish dito sa macro and measurement, we will definitely do it next week, and we'll definitely finish monetary system by next week. Almost 100%. The reason why I'm spending a lot of time here is because there's a major difference, as you'll see, there's a major difference between the United States outlook or how they teach this and how they understand the GDP versus the Philippines. And I think mas ma-appreciate natin yung actual sistema ng Philippines. So as users of GDP, as users of CPI, we should really know how all of these things are generated. So anyway, my midterm on November 6, which will cover the topics prior to the midterm. Magkaka-final tayo at some date, hindi ko pa alam. Announce ni department as usual. And then yung mga topics sa final will be the intervening topics here. Now, if you notice, here's our schedule or table. May additional briefing papers tayo. Oh, I should really add this. Like, okay, I'm going to update some of this DE stuff just to make sure everything is connected. Chain root, Marisa. Oh, here we go. Kasi growth of the Philippine structural transformation. Okay. Right. So Dumagad's paper is already down there. But I'm expecting you guys to do a chain weight paper or to have read the chain weight paper by next week. All right. So my midterm and my final, that's 50%. Homework, 30%. So homework will be a little tougher. It will be still the homework coming from ManQ, but I will put in some more difficult homework. I'd also like to do homework using actual Philippine data. So after I talk a little bit about this syllabus, I'll ask for some questions, if any. And then I'll also ask about you to introduce yourselves and to tell me what your research interests are, what you want to accomplish in the next year and a half, and kung ano yung comfort level ninyo with the different, quantitative software, starting with Excel, maybe some Stata, some R, whatever it is that you would like to use, you can just tell us about it. Okay, so spend some time telling us about that. So there's homework. It will be theory concepts coming from ManQ, real empirical work. And I'm not talking regression here. Again, you can tell me what your statistical background is. I don't expect you to do the actual, regression, but at least I would like for you to process the data, import it, visualize it, get me some statistics, and later on, because it's a big part, get what's called, calculate economic growth, calculate growth, and decompose growth into its different components. So that's pretty important. All of that can be done in Excel technically. And then if you can do more than that, such as if you're interested in just trying, if you're interested in just trying Excel, trying R, I'm an R person. I also have some Stata. So if you want, we can also spend a lot of time in class studying up R and studying Stata, how to import, how to process, how to plot. Okay. I think that will be an important and essential part of your training. And then finally, you've got the briefing papers. So we are about 8 people here. I'm glad. So because konti lang tayo, we can really do this. This will be like the journal club part ng class natin. Okay? Oh yeah, this is basically what I talked about. Homework taken from the back of the book or assigned at the end of class or data work where I'll ask you to download actual data, process, plot, you know. Briefing papers, we'll be bringing in papers or book chapters on the Philippine macro economy. I should delete this. Example. Yeah, I just delete this. So I wanted to list down here sana before. Wag na lang. Nasa baba na naman siya. Okay. Ngayon, let's talk a little bit about yung briefing papers. In addition to the basic theory in ManQ, and I was worried. Additional readings. So we will also read on the following topics. So as will be clear a little later, macroeconomics is a wide-ranging. And in this one, I've just take a few major themes that I personally have experienced, some have experienced, just having read or having interest in these topics. So I included some of these. I'd like to also read these papers and read them and learn about them with you. By introducing you to these papers, this could inspire you to contribute more to these research areas. So maybe at the end of this degree, you can think about some of these issues and think about how to contribute to some of these research areas, or to seek out information on other things that might interest you. So again, I might not cover everything that would interest everyone. So please take this time also to develop, yung parang yung tasting in what you want or are interested in research-wise or intellectually. What would stimulate yourself from a macro perspective, intellectually. Of course, that assumes that you guys are into macroeconomics. That's not necessarily the case, but maybe this course will also inspire you to have this intersection between like a your microeconometrics or microeconomics work and sort of link it to some macro topic. As you'll see, there's lots of intersections there, and it will be very clear later on. Now, as part of your evaluation, you must summarize the paper, number one, and then comment on any two papers. Okay. As part of your paper, make sure to include as your comment or discussion the methodology, data, and results as related to the topics in this course. So kaya ako sinama yung mga papers na yun is because those papers relate to the topics in this course. Okay. And that's why these topic areas will be related to the broad topics that ManQ talks about. Next, what I want you to do actually is contrast these results or discussion, contrast this to results and discussion in other papers, okay? Or other work regarding the Philippines or other countries, or to theory, or to measurement, or even to recent events and updated data. So some of these are dated, meaning mga 10 years ago plus. So baka gusto nyong gawa ng bago, right? A perfect example really would be the chain weight example. So I'll talk about the chain weight paper next week, and everything is super clear in that paper. You can actually bring up the new updated rebased 2018 data, use that, and try to contribute and see if chain weight, for example, is in fact something that might be useful. And Dr. Dumagan in his paper argues that it is useful. So again, this is something that we might discuss next week. So parang ganon, right? So that's an example. For that, you can look for the chain weight. You could grab recent data and check if you can still make the same argument that Dumagan makes. Okay. And there are so many other papers. I won't, not yet, don't belabor the point. But these are the kinds of things I expect you to write in your 2-page discussion or commentary about the paper. So i-relate mo sa iba. Other examples would be the Philippines. Just to pick another example. So you could say, if this is a paper about X in the Philippines, you could, like Google, try to search for the same topic, X in Vietnam, X in Thailand, or X in the broader Asian context. Ganun. So you can say, the Philippines is ganito, the Philippines is ganyan, compared to this and that, etc. Pwede in theory. Like, in the US, the mainstream theory says X ang value ni Y. So kunwari, if Y is some sort of parameter that you're interested in, because of the theory, say marginal propensity to consume, sa US, ganito yung size ng marginal propensity to consume. Sa Pilipinas, ano yun? At bakit? And how did they find marginal propensity to consume in the US in this particular other example? And in the Philippines, we'll be talking about marginal propensity to consume. May research now on that. How did how did those people in that paper calculate marginal propensity to consume? Do you understand my point? How you want to think about these papers. Okay. So pick something simple, interesting. So kailangan it touches your brain. So parang it scratches that intellectual itch. So you have to look at it and really find something interesting. And makikita ko yan eh. As a reader, I can really figure it out. Tsaka hindi mo ito matcha-chat GPT. So you might think, what is the most interesting thing about Jesus Dumaga? That won't work. You have to figure it out and you have to explain to me why you found it interesting. And then you actually have to do something more with it, sana. Okay? So I'll be judging you based on that condition, on these things, how interesting you convinced me about it and what more you compared it to, or how you contextualized the result, or how you maybe updated some of the results and so on. So again, this is just examples. Things you could contrast as a result with a Southeast Asian country, contrast the result with a Southeast Asian country. Another one, there's change in the result if you have updated data. I don't expect complex econometrics. Some of these can be complex. So for example, if we're talking about estimation of this function, consumption function, or the Phillips curve, I don't expect you necessarily to do that. But if you were interested in it, I wouldn't stop you. If we have a different or conflicting result from received theory, right? If the theory says this, bakit sa Pilipinas ganito lang? Parang ganon, right? Again, that's a great, going back to the whole goal of the course, is sana this sort of sparks a research interest. And this is one of the ways in which research interests can spark if you're contrasting certain results to other results, other places, etc. Right? I expect you to do some data visualization if it's possible, if you have new data. Some of these papers don't have data visualization. And when we get to those papers, we'll talk about it. But one famous example here is the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve relates unemployment versus inflation. And you know what's funny? Edmund Phillips, when he first developed that, had pictures of the Phillips curve. And until now, say, if you were to follow, oh my God, I forgot his name. C. Berkeley, he's an economic historian / macroeconomist. I forget his name, but he would always like put plots there, plotting the different, how the Phillips curve slope changes over time or changes depending on the time period and so. We have none of that, to my knowledge. And it would be amazing if we could visualize the Phillips curve for the Philippines. Iba pa yon from the statistical test. To help you to know what's interesting, we will of course go through the theory, talk about that paper, possibly some related work in class. I expect you to have intelligent takes on the paper, to have read the paper. I expect you to talk about your takes. Okay, talk about or ask questions like, what if ganito versus ganyan? And then in class, with the help of other people in the class, we can also like maybe brainstorm how it can be done, that sort of check or some sort of comparison. So what you write or do is your call. And it's part of your task in the paper to convince us why your take is interesting. So maximum 3 pages, but 2 pages would be perfect. So there will be two of these. The first will be the week after the midterm. The second will be due finals week. So there's more than enough time. So let's go back to the schedule. So the ones for the midterm are the chain weight, the papers on fiscal policy and fiscal multipliers, the papers on Phillips curve, and the microdata topics on sticky prices, sticky wages. So that's for the midterm. And then, of course, for the final, ibang set naman. You're expected to grab a paper from these. Now, if you're interested in writing a reaction to another paper, that's not just a really spur na talagang gusto, etc. I would love to share it with everyone, and then you can also discuss it, and that would be amazing, actually. So if you can, lalo na if you're interested in this particular topic. Okay, so that's it, I think. These are the papers. So let's go through a little bit of them. Capital flows and flight. So a little backstory about myself. Ito yung undergraduate paper ko. I did capital flight. Ed Silbeja, I also naging teacher ko rin siya. He was a new teacher when I was there. Ateneo siya. Nag-graduate ako ng Ateneo. Ito yung aking dissertation, capital flight. So back in the day, yung mga panahon ni post-Marcos and Marcos, especially Marcos era. So one of the things that was documented was there's a lot of capital flight, like right before the EDSA. And they wanted to like measure capital flight. Capital flight is mainly a measurement issue. And again, I'd like to hear your comments because this is actually a contentious measurement issue. If you were to read a lot of accompanying papers on that. So we can talk about it. And until now, this is a recent paper. And apparently, Beha's conclusion was that you thought capital flight was big before. Measured capital flight in the 2000s is, in fact, larger in magnitude. So that's interesting, I think. And which either you believe that it's real capital flight in the sense of, kasi capital flight is a theory that says capital is leaving because of expropriation, baka kunin ng gobyerno, etc. And the less confident people are in the government, the more capital flight there is. But what does it tell you that even in the so-called, I don't know, growth years of the Philippines from the 2000s to the early 2000s, that the magnitude, I don't know about the percent, but the magnitude, malaki rin. So that would be interesting. Some discussion topics. Right? Ang daming pwedeng gawing other papers. Capital flight specifically, I went down the rabbit hole when I read his paper because if you think capital flight is a problem in the Philippines, go to Africa. And African capital flight is next level. Okay. Anyway, that's something you can think about. Chain weight. Avoiding anomalies of GDP. Ito pala, chain weight GDP. Meron pang isang paper pala si dito. Si Dumagan. Okay, I just doubled it. Maybe I'll erase this one. So this is the chain weight paper, which we'll be introducing today and talking in depth next week. Now, fiscal policies. I'm sure you guys have studied macro before because you guys have graduated college. You know what fiscal policy is generally. I won't bother doing belated, explanation and an elaborated, expanded definition or slower college level definition. Alam na natin yan. We have also local studies and very, very interesting ones talking about the size of the fiscal multiplier. Very interesting stuff. And these papers sort of mimic the studies in the US and other developed countries as well, looking at evidence for the fiscal multiplier. Phillips curve. So do we have a Phillips curve in the Philippines? Do we have a trade-off between inflation and unemployment? Part of the policy policy effect of that is that sometimes to get rid of inflation, you have to accept a certain slack in GDP. You have to lower GDP essentially, and you have to increase unemployment. So that's one of the one of the policy effects coming out of, if you believe in a regular Phillips curve, right? That there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So the big question is, do we have that in the Philippines, and what is the trade-off? And like we said earlier about data viz, no one has actually data viz this one to my mind. There should be a slope there if there is in fact a Phillips curve. So neither of these papers, I checked them, neither of these have the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve plays a role here, even though the word Phillips curve is not in this paper. So micro foundations for macro models. So we'll be talking about assumptions of macro models in a moment. And part of this is price adjustment, the frequency of price adjustment, under the whole rubric of sticky prices and sticky wages. So on sticky prices, sticky wages, that's an assumption in a lot of the models that we'll be talking about. It is essentially how real quantities can change based off changes in monetary policy. So nominal values can affect real values if there's some sort of rigidity sa economy. And so we're sort of relying on this to come up with, you'll see in the models. So in the most advanced models of this, you've got really advanced new Keynesian models that are very high-tech, and they explicitly have an assumption in there for sticky prices. And the whole question is, ano yung sticky prices literature sa Pilipinas? Is it true that prices are sticky in the Philippines? We'll be talking more about this later, of course. Debts. So we'll be talking, but this paper talks about debt, government debt, because macro and government actions, fiscal and monetary policy, are intertwined with debt. And the whole question is it dangerous to have debt? How much debt is too much? What does it mean when we have sustainable debt? And there are lots of examples where things went belly up in other countries. They had too much debt, and there was a debt crisis. There was also a debt crisis in the Philippines. But in recent years, there have been debt crises in other countries where certain African countries have stopped paying back their debt. And we can look at those more recent stories. And then we can also do some, historic work by looking at Philippine debt and debt sustainability, especially back during this particular time and the time prior to that, the Marcos era as well. So debt problems played a significant role in that regime. Bakit nagkaroon tayo ng recession? And then we'll be spending a couple of weeks, probably a month actually, in growth. Like I said, growth and development is very similar. But here we'll be really talking about bird's eye view of all of the major growth models. And then we'll be talking definitely about a couple of papers on applying these same models to the Philippines. What I can say is that the regressions here are not particularly complex, and the data is also particularly easy to get. I don't say easy to get, but easier to get, and it's not particularly hard. So if you were interested in all of this, we can actually do that. I'm also interested here in structural transformation, which is the Fabella and Dawai paper. Essentially, i-contextualize rin natin to in other countries. The Philippines basically had a maximum, basically we maxed out on industry years ago, and now nag-decline na yung industry share natin. And the services share of the macroeconomy is rising. And then that has implications on development and growth across the different countries, such that if your country has a higher turning point, meaning the share of the economy, at which point the share of industry is falling, right? The turning point is higher. that implies something about your growth rate and your development and your standard of living. And of course, that also brings about in growth strategies. Is it possible to grow with services? Or should we reconsider supporting further industry, even though we've maximized, we've already turned the corner? Or again, going back to like industrial agriculture and trying to support that and to use that as a means to develop further, access export markets, gain foreign exchange, and so on. So development strategy. And then here's a full list of readings for other things that are related to all of this. In particular, I'm quite interested in this macro model because what's cool about this is that all of the things that we're going to study about income determination in the short run, it can be quantified and turned into a small macro model. So this is an example. So we'll probably spend some time again in class just going through what can be done quantifying these theories. So these theories are not just concepts and ideas. They're also ways to actually measure and quantify actual economic policies on the ground, Philippine economic policies. So it's very exciting. I think this is truly cool. I am, of course, learning this at the same time you are. And I'm hoping when it comes to this. So I'm also, Mike, so mag housekeeping na tayo. I share. Taking a little bit of a coffee break. And if there are no questions, then I guess we'd go to the second part of this class, of this first part, and ask for some introductions. Oh yeah, there's a question. Go ahead, Claudine, if you have a mic.
Hi sir, tig-chat ko po yung question.
Chinat mo
Pero
ba? Ito. Sorry. Sir, available po ba lahat ng papers to read online? Yes. And yung midterm and final equally 25%. Yes. So yeah, all of these papers should be Googleable. These are all like BSP working papers, blah, blah, blah. Very easy. When we do discuss it and for some reason you can't find it, I have it because I've read them. I've not really read them completely, but I've skimmed through them and I've decided to want to include them in the course. Yeah. Any questions about yung class and yung policies? I expect full attendance. I will not measure or mark attendance, but I think I will not handhold people who are not coming to class. Except for this first week na wala pa sa uble. may konting handholding. Kasi wala pa sa uble. And I'm hopeful to have all of them there because the homework will be done through Uble. I'll be writing down the homework there. And then you can submit the homework through Uble or in person. Okay lang, whatever is easier. But again, I won't really handhold ano nangyari dito, blah, blah, blah. I expect you to come and write down notes, the usual, right? The usual. But anything about the policy? Pag umuulan, pag pag signal number 1 sa Quezon City, siguro wag na lang, di ba? I-online na lang natin. Okay, because there are no further questions and you might want to end early, let's continue. So I'd want everyone to one by one introduce themselves, like your name and then your background, your experience sa econ and your research, your research goals, if any, what interests you. Wag mahiya kung yung sagot is I don't know, then okay, then I don't know. But then I guess anyway, we'll have a conversation. So let's start with Claudine. Do you have access to your mic? All right. So now we'll get into the actual class, and I will share the file. I'll just share the desktop so it's easier. Can everyone see my screen right now?
Yes, Prof.
Yeah, because I'll be going in and out of different files. Okay, so yeah, we'll be talking about the science of macro and a little bit about the macro data, specifically GDP. Next week, we'll be doing some work on chained weight, and we'll be finishing macro data, specifically unemployment, specifically CPI, etc. So let's go through this really quickly since you've done this before. This is based on, let me show everyone the book that I have. This is the 7th edition of ManQ. And this basically is, I've just, essentially tried to summarize chapter 1. And I will go through that really quickly right now. Because, you guys have graduated college, you're working, you know what you're doing. We don't have to do this. But I'm just going to show you essentially what's going on. Okay? So we'll jump straight into some other things. So this is the science of macroeconomics. Okay, what is the subject matter of macro? Right. So it's the study of national level economies or the study of economies as a whole. So historically speaking, macro was born because it suddenly became interesting or possible, or governments were made aware that their policies had an effect on these macro statistics such as GDP, GNP, inflation, unemployment rate, that they could measure these things and they could also sort of affect it or influence it. In particular, some of the big or major events that led to the birth of modern macro is the Depression, right? The Great Depression, and John Maynard Keynes, he basically also discovered how to avoid recession, and that's essentially his contribution to economics, and basically he helped birth modern macroeconomics, right? Which sort of like tries to study these macro aggregates like GDP, GNP. And it's national level economies because they were talking about government policies at the national level. The reason I'm harping on this is because, in a sense, this is an arbitrary distinction. You can do a macroeconomics of any size. As I'll be clear later, we'll have some examples of actual studies of studying different aggregations of players or firms or workers or labor, etc. So it seems one of the major reasons really to study a national level macro, national level economies or macro as it's currently understood is because the government level policies, generally speaking, are national level. And we'll be spending a lot of time talking about government policies and its interaction with these macro statistics. So yeah, these involve our understanding and construction of these macro statistics, such as GDP, GNP, inflation, unemployment, etc. We'll be spending a lot of time thinking and talking about discussing how the Philippines does it. We'll be using a ManQ as a guide, meaning the topics will be there, the theories will be there, but the actual construction of the data and the actual data sana will be purely Philippines. To the extent that it's not possible, given the limitations in Philippine statistical capabilities, then we'll talk a little bit about what other things were done in other contexts. And maybe since you guys could be in a position later on to push for some kind of statistics to be gathered, right? Then it might be possible to do some of those other things. All right. So why is macro important? Everyone knows this. It affects the lives of everyone in the country. It affects everyone in the future. Decisions about the macroeconomy today, like the debt level, will definitely affect the future. Decisions about human capital accumulation, decisions about debt and infrastructure, all of that will affect people today and definitely people in the future. Lalo na kung pumalpak. Like, for example, may problema, nagkaroon ng infrastructure, it didn't work, it becomes this mothball, whatever, then it becomes this albatross, and it really also affects the future in this time in a negative way. Moreover, these statistics are important. Businesses look to these to assess the health of the country, to assess whether you should invest in the country. I think someone was doing credit ratings, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Randy? Sorry, Ralph?
Yes,
GDP, all of these macro numbers are an important part of your previous work in credit evaluation. Credit evaluation at the country level ka ba or personal level?
At the corporate level.
The corporate level. So this is just the corporate analog.
Yes.
And for example, the corporate level, you're interested in like itong business ba ito nasa Botswana na mahirap, may GDP, ang taas na inflation, etc. Kikita ba yan? All of those things, all of these macro statistics will affect firm industry performance. Ano pa ba? Usually, and again, this is where I start, tickling your intellectual curiosity. Although this is still an open question in the Philippines, national governments are judged based on the performance on these indicators. So this is particularly established by Bruce Bartlett sa United States, that you don't want to be a president that leads, that ushers in or welcomes a recession, for example. You will definitely be voted out according to all of that, right? And in this particular case, in the current one, there's been studies as well that even in the age of Trump, where ang daming problema ni Trump, no one really cares. They're interested in inflation. They're interested in protecting their jobs. So all of those things are still the bread and butter policies in the United States, even though there are other reasons. But in the Philippines, it's an open question, I think. Also in the Philippines, at the local level, whether local economic conditions affect local executives' ability to get elected or not, or it doesn't matter. As such, these statistics are heavily monitored. We have spent, by we, I mean the Philippine Statistics Authority, the Bangko Sentral, the people who are involved in macro statistics. These guys are always investing, always trying to make sure that their capacity is there, always trying to fulfill yung minimum that's required para maging consistent with UN definitions. We're very much interested in making sure our GDP and GNP numbers are the best possible given the budget constraints. And we'll be spending a lot of time. That's why I don't mind spending a lot of time today and next week about measurement, because I think these are some of the most interesting things ever. And as users of these statistics in the future, it doesn't even matter if it's a dissertation or not, just reading, then you'll find out, wow, there's interesting things that are behind these numbers, because these numbers will be in the news forever. All right, so let me now, again, tickle your intellectual curiosity. So macro is a wide-ranging topic. So ang daming pwedeng pag-usapan. Growth is number one, and development generally. So you've got cross-country comparisons of growth rates, measurement of growth itself, decomposition of the growth, what are the growth strategies? That's also very interesting, the topic of a lot of research. What are the drivers, or what is important for growth, what's not important for growth. Someone mentioned poverty and inequality and welfare. So growth and poverty, growth and inequality, these are actually very interesting topics that, since people are interested in welfare and poverty, I'm thinking of adding a couple of those papers. Specifically, the topic of the papers are, okay, is it enough to drive growth, and will growth be enough to lift the tide for all boats, including the poor, right? Yun yung core concept dito, or core issue when it comes to this. Or will growth, or the growth and inequality literature is also interesting. Is inequality necessary for growth to happen? So do you need to have like this mass, this is perhaps a caricature of that literature, but they're saying we need to have this mass labor force, wages are low, hungry for work, and they're all interested in getting these manufacturing jobs where mababa yung income, but they're able to, businesses are able to basically hire them and to go up the value chain, etc., etc. So inequality is necessary. Inequality will rise, but then inequality will fall. This is called the Kuznets curve. And then there's an environmental Kuznets curve, which is for the environment, but this is an inequality Kuznets curve. So a lot of these things, I'm thinking of adding these, and some people are interested in that later, but we'll be talking about growth at the end anyway, so it will be easy to add a paper or two on inequality and or poverty. Inflation, of course, major. What drives inflation? What can government do? Especially if it's either a demand side or a supply side issue. And right now, people are thinking it's a demand side issue. Is there still room for monetary and or fiscal policy under these conditions? And so on and so forth. Very interesting stuff. That's just, a major big picture stuff. This just, you can spend months talking about, determination of inflation, relationship between individual markets and overall inflation. Employment and unemployment. Labor economics is itself an entire field. Very interesting stuff. Yeah. In this course, we'll be like sort of introducing not just the supply and demand market for labor, the usual, but we'll try to introduce some matching, some search frictions, try to at least the concept. And as of right now, wala pa tayong paper actually on search frictions to my knowledge. And I've tried to look. Search frictions and sort of estimating empirically the macroeconomically search frictions and its ability to impair employment. Meron tayong other issues on employment, like underemployment, like measuring what, I have not seen this either, like the macroeconomics of underemployment. Let's say create a model where, okay, let's say that you are able to correct the underemployment problem. How will that affect GDP? I think that's an unanswered question. It's theoretical, sure, but I think it's an interesting one. In a sense, people take that for granted that, okay, if we increase the underemployment rate, decrease the underemployment rate, it would have to be better. But is that true? Et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, we have that kind of problem, underemployment rate in the Philippines. Balance of payments, open economy, this itself is its own topic. It's called international macroeconomics, right? Entire course can be designed about this. We'll be talking about trade balance, financial flows, cross-border investments, exchange rate determination. All of these things are part of that. And we'll talk about this a little bit, especially with the Philippine experience. Again, you can talk about meron dapat Philippine economic history. And that's really where we should spend most of our time there. So dito pahapyaw lang talaga. It's really like what happened and the sort of things that could happen in other countries and in the Philippines. The workhorse model for this course really is the short run income determination model. So we will definitely be learning that. This is something you might have also learned before, but here we'll try to do a harder version. In particular, there is a working paper in our reading list where you can convert this idea of the usual Keynesian cross ASAD model and turn it into a small macro model. So that's something for you guys to like be exposed to. And all of those people who are interested in like health and whatever, and try to like connect it to macro. Like this kind of modeling, CGE style, small macro models could be a way in and to try to think about how those topics sort of can affect the macro economy. Kung may makita kayong paper, please just mention it and I'll try to include it. And of course, we'll be talking about fiscal policy and monetary policy. In our course here, we'll be talking about the marginal propensity to consume, which is a crucial parameter in the effectiveness of monetary policy. And there have been attempts to measure that in the Philippines. And it would be cool if you guys can, like, it would be cool to like sort of read what's going on in the Philippines with regard to fiscal policy, the effectivity of fiscal policy in the Philippines, as well as monetary policy. Some of these will involve really powerful math. I don't expect everyone to know it, and Econ 101 is not really the time to know that. but at least I'll try to expose you guys and to make sure you guys are aware that this thing exists. And if you really want to delve into that, this is the thing that you might, want to spend a lot of your time on in the future. Government debt and taxation, this is essentially public economics, or at least one half of public economics. And we'll be just talking a little bit about government debt sustainability, taxation in the Philippines. Other issues that are important to the macroeconomy in the short run and the long run. So some things that you might be interested in: exports, the competitiveness, quote unquote, of our export sector, the importance of banking and finance. As you will see, there's the circular model of the economy, the flow of money, the ability to extend credit, and ability for firms to expand and or contract, depending on incentives, is quite important, and banking and credit is important to that. Real estate, land, human capital development. Is college worth it? Maraming nagsasabi, free college. I think someone also, si Miguel. Miguel was interested in tertiary education. Is tertiary education in the Philippines worth it? There was a World Bank paper recently. Again, people who might be interested in human capital. The returns to the macro level returns to capital are in fact small and falling relative to everyone else. So that's not great. You can be interested in that. And the question is why? What's going on? Okay. And finally, inefficient allocation of factors of production. So this is like related to B, so banking and finance. So and to real estate as well. So if there's some reason why factors of production can't reallocate themselves, including capital, including money, then, and it could be for various reasons: political economy, risk aversion, lack of information, lack of investment, market power. Any of these things can lead to inefficient allocation of resources as an economy, and that would lead to lower output than otherwise. And there's been a recent literature on this. It's called the wedges literature. And I was thinking later on we could talk about that when it comes to growth. And it's also related kasi to structural transformation as well. So lots of things to think about, lots of things to talk about. We will be running through each of the main bulleted topics here. And then feel free to bring in your own ideas. And I'll try to bring in poverty later on for growth. So let this class be an introduction. And hopefully this can whet your appetite for more macro. I'll try to be really quick here since you guys have studied model building. So in a micro class, there are models, okay? And what important thing about a model is, let me just jump here, because this the diagram encapsulates what your perspective is, your attitude should be when it comes to economics models. So ang economics models will take in exogenous variables into the model, and it will spit out endogenous variables. In this particular example of supply and demand, the endogenous variables are price and quantity. Price and quantity. In this particular example, for the market for pizza, you've got exogenous variables, which in demand would be income of consumers. And in the supply curve, it would be the price of inputs. Okay. And if these exogenous variables change, they will change the value of the endogenous variables within this particular market. So what's crucial here is that it is exogenous only relative to the model that you're studying. So in this case, consumer income, in another context, and consumer income is endogenous. But in this context of the market for pizzas, consumer income is an exogenous factor and can be set exogenously. Similar to this, supply curves, the price of inputs. For the market for pizza, the price of inputs for pizza is essentially a separate issue, or I'll use the term exogenous to the market for pizza itself. So that's why you can conceptually do this, shift or change, or empirically, you'll go to the data and you'll find variation in input prices, and that will change or shift the supply curve, and that will change your, let me just scroll down completely. Mabagal si internet. Mabagal si computer. It will shift to the left, the supply curve, and it will change your endogenous variables, price and quantity. Okay. In macro, speaking of macro specifically, there are many models, and we'll be dealing with many different models. Each of these models will have their own exogenous variables. Each will have their own endogenous variables. And again, the context is important. What is the context and why some variables are exogenous? And the thing that you really want to focus on, those are the endogenous variables. So it's okay. Not everything, even in macroeconomics, where there are so-called general equilibrium effects, there are things that it's still possible to find sort of an exogenous variable. Okay. In particular, so sa national level macro for the Philippines, because we're a small country relative to the world, global variables are typically considered exogenous for us. So for example, if you wanted to do like the price of rice in the Philippines, an exogenous variable would be the world price or the Vietnam price, right? Because these are the prices which are exogenous to us, for example. Although even that is quite questionable, because our import we're one of the largest importers. So it's possible that we'll have a large, outsized effect on the global market also if we try to import. Okay. But it's something, again, that has not really been established. In principle, yes, kaya dapat. But we have to change our actual import size for us to be able to really affect the global price for those, or for any commodity. So that's just an example, right? For the Philippines, we'll usually look at international prices or some global average as an exogenous variable. Okay, so there are also some assumptions in modeling. So some crucial assumptions in the models that we'll be dealing with will be sticky wages and sticky prices. So sticky wages and sticky prices mean that prices and wages do not adjust immediately to clear markets. We were just talking about the price and the quantity demanded supplied for pizzas. So in that example, when demand or supply shifts, there is an adjustment, and when price goes up or down, quantity goes up or down. Ironically, in macro, we are going to make an assumption that not all prices will change, even though the market conditions change. And that is the sticky price and sticky wage assumption. Okay. Medyo intuitive sa atin. I mean, I guess we can sense that maybe not. Yeah? But there is actually an empirical literature abroad in other countries and now in the Philippines. So I've added a paper on that, trying to look at the micro level price change and how that sort of translates into the sticky price and sticky wage assumption. Meaning, again, only a fraction of prices, the sticky prices and sticky wages don't say that prices and wages do not adjust. They say that only a fraction adjusts at a time. And there will still be adjustment. Right? Of course, because if prices and wages do not adjust, that is impossible because inflation is all about the measurement of price changes, right? So if sticky prices is truly sticky and that everyone cannot change, then walang inflation, which is preposterous on its face. What we're really saying is that hindi lahat nag-a-adjust agad and only a subset adjusts. And it's that share of firms that adjust. That's the big question. And when it comes to these macro models, the more advanced macro models, that sort of explicitly have to assume a rate of price stickiness, then this kind of empirical analysis is quite crucial to link the micro level to the macro level. Yeah, but that's an assumption. In the models that we'll be talking about mainly in this course, especially coming from ManQ, we are going to say that as a background check, there's going to be sticky prices and sticky wages in the background. But in more advanced papers, and hopefully I can share with you some treatments of that, you have to explicitly model within the system the amount of stickiness. And as you vary the stickiness, then the model, of course, will change its outcome or its output. Another assumption is optimization by consumers and firms. So at the background of our models here is that consumers maximize their utility and they have a demand curve that is a reflection of that. And then firms similarly will maximize profits and their supply curves are a function of that. In the models that we have here in class, and the ones that I expect you to really know, optimization by firms and consumers will be in the background. And then we'll basically assume that the demand curve exists. We'll say that the supply curve exists, and we'll just play around with the slopes, the elasticities of demand and supply. In some very advanced models, you will include the kind of utility function, the kind of firm competition. And then here you can, in fact, play around with it. You can say, what happens when firms have market power? What happens when firms have specific market power? How will that affect all of the macro things that we'll be talking about? Adjustment to the new equilibrium in output, inflation expectations, etc., etc. So ang daming pwedeng paglaruan later on. But then in this course, we'll be having these assumptions in the background, basically assuming they're there, assuming some assumption regarding consumers and firms optimizing and sticky wages and sticky prices. Okay, just interrupt me if you want to interrupt me. Okay, so right now, here's our last topic, which is GDP. So just to give you a lay of the land, we'll be talking about GDP in the abstract, very general first. And then we'll be talking about specifics about computation in a moment. We won't finish all of the topics of GDP. We'll be doing chain weight next week. And the rest of the items here will also be doing next week, such as CPI and so on. So first, principles coming from ManQ ito. What is gross domestic product? So we can have a definition. GDP, or gross domestic product, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within an economy in a given period of time. So if you studied macro before, this is probably your working definition. Okay. Important phrases here: market value, right? So think about, what does market value mean? That means it's in pesos. Next, all final goods and services. There is sort of a desire to measure all final goods and services. Yeah. So kailangan lahat na produce in an economy in terms of goods and services kasama. And it has to be time bound. So you're talking about a month, a quarter, a year. So some concepts. Two ways to view this GDP concept, right? The income approach, or the total income, or the total expenditure, or the expenditure approach. So what this is saying is that this definition is essentially equivalent to a total income point of view or a total expenditure point of view. An economy is a collection of consumers and producers, which in macro, again, is in part of the political borders of a country. Again, it need not be a country. So just to focus on some counter examples. So in the United States, basically, there's a collection of countries called quote unquote states. They have a common macro policy. Okay. Pwedeng ganon. The states can come together and say, we will be governed politically by this federal system, and our macro policy will be at the federal level. EU is another example, with monetary policy being, again, at the supranational level. Even subnationally, you could think about the macroeconomics of the Philippines as like NCR being its own place, where labor factors can come in and out of NCR, but then there are these frictions, right? And how NCR trades with the rest of the country. Now let's go back to income and expenditure. So these two things are equivalent and can be seen in the circular flow model of the economy. So GDP is a flow. We'll be looking at this in a moment after this paragraph. GDP is a flow. It tells us about the amount of pesos circulating in an economy in a given amount of time. The expenditure flow of pesos on products and services is equal to the income received by the factors of production that produced it. These producers or consumers as wages, rental, and profit. So now let's take a look at the circular model. And we want to sort of convince ourselves based on the circular model that the income approach to GDP and the expenditure approach is essentially equivalent. So this is the circular flow model. We've got households on the one hand and firms. The government would also be here. But then to simplify matters, let's assume that there's one product and then households basically purchase this product and they consume it. So from firms, the actual product goes to the households. To produce the product, you need factors of production like labor. So the households provide or sell labor to firms. So that's the blue line here, which is the flow of factors of production and the flow of final products. Yeah. But these things have a value, right? These things have a value. So that's why there's an expenditure and income approach, right? So labor that is sold from households to firms will receive income. Okay. And then households which buy and purchase these goods that firms produce, they give money, the value of the goods, to the firms. So umiikot rin ang pera. And it's GDP as money, as valued as money, because it's the market value of GDP. It's really this outer curve that we're sort of measuring here, given nominal GDP, because it's the price expenditure valued at the price, which is the market price. And that's the next paragraph here. It's in terms of value, dapat, and market price. This is how we're able to aggregate all of the value of production in the economy. So you've got the different products and you need to aggregate that, and you're able to aggregate that by assigning a price to each one, and you're aggregating it because everything is worth something in pesos. So the value in pesos. So you put everything in there. So you can imagine it in your head as a listing of total expenditure on goods and services. So GDP is equal to a summation of these values from P1, X1, the price and value, the value of good one, value of good two, all the way to the nth good and service. And you can imagine a very, very long list. How about used goods? So here we'll talk about a little bit about the complications of computing GDP, the concept of which is the total value of production of final goods and services. How about used goods? GDP is only about production in an economy in a given time period. If goods have been produced earlier, then it's not counted for that particular year. What about inventories? So suppose that these are produced in the year, but remain unsold this year. So this is included in GDP as it's purchased by producers at market value. When it's sold later on, it has no effect on GDP because inventories will fall and consumption rises by the same amount. So part of the story here is that inventories that are purchased, that are basically goods purchased by producers, are in investment. So nasa I siya. We'll be talking a little bit more about the expenditure approach later. But right now, we're just talking about the fact of, goods and services nga siya, but what kind, are there stipulations about how to think about what kinds of goods and services are included in the computation? Okay. And the answer is inventories is definitely kasama. Now, and this is the most important thing really. Products are usually produced as part of a value chain. GDP only includes the final goods production. Intermediate goods are part of the cost of the final good and are already included in the production value of the final good. One way to compute this is using value added at each stage of production, which is one of the methods to calculate GDP. So in concept, GDP is basically the sum of the market value of the final goods of the economy. So you can imagine this summation, but now you have to think of Q specifically as final goods and services. Final goods and services. Or you can think of the summation here in terms of I'm gonna include this, or in terms of value added, or the summation of value added. Summation of value added. And that, in principle, is how GDP is sort of conceived and calculated. Okay, so let's talk about an approach to measuring GDP, which is called expenditure approach. Now, in this approach, GDP is a function of, or the summation of, yung uses and who uses it, right? C, I, G, and N. Okay. So if this thing is about production, this thing is about expenditure or using it or consuming it. So let's think about definitions of the expenditure approach. Consumption consists of goods and services bought by households. So there are three broad categories: non-durable goods, durable goods, and then services. So somehow we have to figure out what the durable goods that people buy are, and what the durable goods are, and what is the value of all of that, and what are the services, and what's the value of all of that. Investment consists of goods for future use. So that's what capital is. You produce something which will be useful to produce goods in the future. So investment is divided into three subcategories: fixed investment, business fixed investment, or capital formation; residential fixed investment; and inventory investment. We already talked about inventory investment earlier, wherein in inventories, these are products purchased in the year but remain unsold in the year. These will be indicated as an increase in GDP, but it will be in inventories. It will be lodged as an inventory. G in the expenditure approach are government consumption and investment naman. Government purchases are the goods and services bought by federal, state, and local governments. Now, net exports is the value of goods and services sold to other countries. So it's exports minus the goods and services that foreigners sell us. So this is important. Bakit siya net? Bakit siya mina-minus? Bakit consumption? Bakit imports mina-minus? So this is a minus because we're interested in, essentially, GDP is the production of final goods in the Philippines. So imports represents consumption of Filipinos, yes, but consumption of foreign products and services, which is why you want to subtract it out of GDP, right? So if we import something and it's for consumption, tataas ang consumption, pero bababa ang GDP because tataas ang imports. Imports come in as a minus. So NX is exports minus minus. I should express that. Oops, sorry. Minus. So that's why minus ang imports, because we want to really focus on production domestically. Whereas net exports, these are products that are produced in the Philippines that we are shipping or giving or selling or providing other countries, including say services exports ito. Net exports. So basically, these are the ones that are produced in the country that are exported. So that is in principle GDP. And let me just show you guys the chapter conceptually, right? Chapter 2, we have got the circular flow, rules for computing GDP, just to go through the book, right? The GDP is just a summation of these different numbers. Like if you had a lot of goods and services, this would go on for pages, but now consider two products, apples and oranges. And this would be GDP. Because these are, by assumption, final goods. Then you've got used goods, treatment of inventories, intermediate goods and value added, okay, which is important. Okay. One way to compute the value of all final goods is the sum of value added in production. We will be returning to this because this is in fact how the PSA does it. And here we've got consumption items, which there might not be market prices. Okay. Although most goods and services are valued at market prices, some are not sold in the marketplace. Some are provided by the government as public goods, but they're still consumed. So what people in the United States will do is for these things to have an imputed value. So in the book, two examples, just one. I'll just talk about one example. An example of an imputed value is rental services for a house that you own. So remember, if you buy a house that is sort of residential investment that will show up as I, but you should also have residential consumption. So yung residential consumption, because you're not paying rent to yourself, pupunta yun dapat sa C, but then we don't know what that is. And therefore, we need to know what the value of that is. And that's why we use imputation to determine what the value of the rental services are. Ginagawa rin ni Pilipinas yan. Estimating or imputing the value of residential services. So an important paragraph here, not important for Manthew and for the United States, but important for us because in the Philippines, we have to really think hard about the informal or underground economy. So I'll be showing you guys the PSA methods later, and then sort of trying to assess the underground economy is key. Okay. All right. Now let's get into some interesting topics about the estimation of GDP in the Philippines specifically. So we can turn to GDP estimation, much more limitations than developed country estimations. We will be using the production approach. And ito yung, I expect you guys to know this and to have read this. All of this comes from the National Accounts FAQ. So I just basically copy pasted it. But as you'll see here, how we compute GDP is the gross value added for all resident producer units. So this is the way we figure out or calculate yung value of final products, right? Which is to use na value added. Okay. So gross value added is defined as the value of output less the value of intermediate consumption. Output is defined as the goods and services produced by an establishment. It's equal to the value of sales adjusted for changes in inventories of finished goods, that is goods produced and ready for sale but not yet sold, or goods adjusted for sales of goods produced in an earlier period. So we talked about inventories earlier. It's exactly the same thing. Meanwhile, intermediate consumption consists of the value of the goods and services consumed as inputs by a process of production, excluding fixed assets whose consumption is recorded as consumption of fixed capital. So it's another thing, that's the same thing as housing. So housing stock is an investment and you're consuming it. It's the same idea.
Sir, pwede po mag-question.
Pwede pong magtanong? Gusto niyo pong magtanong? Okay, go ahead.
Gusto ko lang po i-clear kung naintindihan ko po ng sakto. Yung sa inventories po, di ba, for that current year, ilalagay na po siya as purchased sa inventories. Yung inventories.
Yes.
Paano po if...
sa investment, not sa consumption.
What if po yung kunwari, di ba, purchased siya sa current market value of that year, pero nabenta siya sa mga later years ng higher market value. Paano po i-adjust po ba yun? Or
well, papasok tayo dun sa real and nominal, I think. Because kung tataas yung value, tataas yung nominal value ng inventory, at tataas rin yung quote-unquote nominal value ng consumption. And dun siya papasok. Because when prices change, the nominal value of the inventory and the nominal value of consumption will also change. Even though technically, the only thing that changes is the price. So yun, dun papasok yun sa nominal. We'll be talking a little bit about nominal in a moment. So nominal versus real. So what's interesting about your example is, the only thing that happened is nagbago yung presyo. And kung magbabago yung presyo, tama ka, magbabago ang inventory, magbabago ang investment, magbabago ang consumption. Because nominal GDP is affected by the current price level at that period, at that time period.
okay, sir, thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much for the excellent question. Thank you. So, okay, so we go to GVA. So hopefully everyone understood GVA, right? So it's output minus the intermediate. So nakalagay. I want to intermediate minus intermediate consumption, meaning yung inputs to production, which is exactly what we talked about before. So operationally, GDP at the production of the Philippine system of national accounts is compiled for industries, which allows the study of industrial activity in the economy, blah, blah, blah. You can read it. We'll be talking about, we need to know output and intermediate consumption. And what's interesting here is this. The aggregates referring to output and intermediate consumption are neither asked in surveys or censuses. So meron ng mea culpa. We don't really know what this is. We don't really directly measure it. For instance, businesses do not directly measure their intermediate uses. Rather, what happens is they record their purchases and the changes in inventories of fuels and materials. These are derived from specific items processed from the results of establishment surveys. So in practice, this is how they do the GVA. Right? So production items. They calculate gross output from these things, and these things are entries sa ASPBI and sa CPBI. Okay. If you're aware of these surveys, then these should be quite familiar to you guys, because these are all questions that are asked in the establishment surveys. And this is how they determine gross output. And then they subtract intermediate consumption to get the gross value added. And then they deem these things as part of intermediate consumption. And then iso-subtract nila ang intermediate from the gross to come up with a gross value added at the sectoral level, GVA. And GDP is the sum of the gross value added for each of the 16 industries and the PSNA as described here. There's a list of industries, which you can take a look, of course, at the FAQ and some other documents, which I will show you. GDP is the sum of the gross value added for the 16 industries. Okay. Industry classification. So in fact, this is how GDP in principle is done through the GVA method, okay? Which again comes from standard. This is the UN standard, and this is how ManQ explains it, although hindi siya, because I really want to focus on how the GDP is actually measured, because you guys are an intermediate class. Kailangan talaga maintindihan ito. Whereas, ManQ just, glosses over a lot of the stuff. Now, an interesting further thing sa Philippines, which is not true in other countries, specifically the United States, and I want everyone in the Philippines to know this, measuring GVA at the industry level takes into account both the goods and services produced by, quote unquote, the organized industry and unorganized industry. Okay, these are the terms that the Philippine Statistical Authority uses. They use these two categories for a more comprehensive picture of the performance of the industries or economy as a whole. So ano ang organized industry? Organized industry includes the establishment and government as producers of market output for own use, non-market outputs. While the unorganized industry includes those that are not part of the organized industry. Okay? Very funny definition. Anyone who is unorganized is by definition not organized, right? But also producers of output, such as households. So let's delve into this a little bit more, okay? So an organized industry measured or computed at the 5-level PSIC, okay? We'll go back to these formulas later. But what's important about it is that the organized uses are basically captured in formal establishment surveys, ASPBI and CPBI, as well as administrative data, other administrative data also included in the estimation of GDP. Okay. So what's important here in these equations here is that they use yung establishment surveys, which are annual, and they use that to calculate GVA, GO, and IC. Okay. So GO, which is gross output, minus IC, which is the intermediate consumption, which is the inputs. And that's how you get gross value added. So that's basically semantic. Parang ganun lang talaga. And yun ang ginagawa ni PSA. And then, using each PSIC 5, which is a fairly disaggregated level, ang PSIC 5 is like paddy, rice, irrigated farmland. Ganun. So each PSIC 5 will be added up here for each JF industry, of which there are 16. So magsasum ka over all the different PSIC 5s, and that will give you GVA of each industry J. Yun. Yun yung organized industry. Now, si unorganized industry, yun nga yung not captured by formal surveys. And how do we capture unorganized industry? Okay. We want to, first of all, why would we want to capture it? Because we know that the unorganized industry is large. Unfortunately, I have not yet determined how large it is. There is a paper by Bersales, and this is the only paper I know in the Philippines that sorts of, back when Lisa Bersales was still the national statistician, she had a paper specifically on measuring or estimating the size of of the what's the euphemism that we call this? The unorganized industry. Okay? So it's almost similar. It should be conceptually the same as formal versus informal. Let me write that down. Look for Bersales. Read Bersales. So maybe I can show this to you guys next week. Informal industry. It's also available online. So if you can Google Bersales informal economy. Okay, so how do we do it? I think this idea of residual employment approach came from that paper of Bersales. So under this approach, first, excuse me, tubig lang. Under this approach, yung gusto mong gawin is to calculate yung total employment. And you get that from the labor force survey. I think it's a labor force survey quarterly or semi-annual. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, it's more regularly done than the firm survey. And then residual employment is determined. So you look at equation 1, the employment of LFS, you subtract from that the employment of organized industry, and the employment data here comes from the establishment survey. Kasi kasama rin sa establishment survey yung employment ni ganito, employment of the different firms, of the different industries. And then this is some positive number. Mas malaki ang employment figures that the LFS will derive than the ones that are covered by the establishment surveys, which are only firms. How do they get the establishment surveys? They get the establishment surveys by having a list of establishments. That's the term that they use. And yung list of establishments come from administrative data from the government, such as registration data from the DTI and the BIR. Okay, so that's how they know. So for all of those guys who are informal, or in this case, what quote unquote unorganized, they use the LFS data, which is based on a per person. So LFS is not a business-based, it's a person-based. We ask a person, are you employed? Where are you employed? What's your industry? So on. So it will come up with a measure of employment that's higher or larger than the one here for the enterprise surveys. And then that's where you will get through the residual. That's why it's called, where is it? The residual employment approach. Residual employment approach. How you get this? It's the residual employment. Okay. So from this, you are going to get the GO, or the gross output of the unorganized industry. So how do you get this? You get this by multiplying labor to the gross output per capita small industries. So I'll quiz you. I'll ask a question. Bakit kailangan per capita? Bakit hindi gross output lang? So just in case people don't understand this one, this is the gross output for the small firms in the so-called formal or organized industry. So titignan mo yung mga small firms dun sa nakalagay or nakasama dun sa ASPBI or sa CPBI, and then you will calculate their gross output per industry. And then that's where you will get this one. But it's GO per capita, per employee. Kaya siya per capita. Per employee. So would you know why it's per employee?
Sir, aren't we assuming in this case that a person who is a person's output in the formal industry is somewhat similar to someone who's employed in an organization?
Precisely, that's it. Tama. You're getting, ina-assume mo that the output per person in the unorganized or informal is the same as the output per person dun sa formal, except that for some reason, informal siya. So that's why you want it per capita, because you want to actually calculate the total GO. So that's why per capita ito, and then you're multiplying it by the number of people. So magdi-disappear yung per capita because this is just GO divided by employment, multiplied by employment, that will give you GO. So that's, my question is actually more mathematical than your answer, but your answer is also correct. That the second thing to infer from the second equation is the average labor output, the average labor productivity for the small firms is equivalent to unorganized firms. Okay. So that's interesting because, and I wanted to point out, a lot of the literature dito sa informal assumes that you are informal for a reason, and that moving from informal to formal will sort of either raise your productivity, or it will statistically, mechanically raise the average productivity because the people who decide to be formal are the ones who are productive. Sila yung may kayang mag-register, may alam magbayad, may tiyagang ganyan, etc. Right? So sila yung, a lot of the macro models that sort of study informal versus formal sort of want to study a trajectory where an economy would become more formal over time, and they say, at least the model assumes, that if you move from informal to formal, then that will raise average productivity either through selection effects, because the people who become productive, who become formal are more productive, therefore raising the average productivity that's measured in the economy, or that the act of being formal itself will turn you into a more productive company. Right? So this one really is an upper bound, I want to say, about upper bound on the productivity, the labor productivity of the unorganized group. And this is an open empirical question as well. And this is one of the things that we should really be interested in. This is, if we are totally wrong, as you said, if this is much smaller than if the real labor per person, output per person rather, for informal is much smaller because they're less productive, then magbabago yung GDP estimation natin, which will have massive repercussions, right? I hope I'm impressing everyone the coolness of this result, right? Okay, that you can use this from a theoretical point of view. There's theoretical studies, and hopefully we can, make some empirical headway here. Anyway, mahirap kasi sila pag-aralan because by definition, informal sila and no one really talks to them systematically, right? Okay. Anywho, meron kang gross output ng unorganized, i-multiply mo yan by gross value added for the small. Gross value added ratio for small establishments. So my gross value added ratio, what is gross value added ratio? This is it. Gross value added ratio is GVA divided by GO. So you will cancel the GOs. You will count, because this is basically it's GVA divided by GO. You will cancel the GO and it will give you a GVA. Pero may implicit assumption rin yan, which is quite similar to the second assumption, right? In that the gross value added ratio, so the value added relative to the gross output for unorganized is the same as the one for organized. Okay? So again, that's an open question. That means you're buying the same inputs to produce a similar output. The value of the inputs is the same. But what if sa informal, mas mahal ang bilhin nila? Di ba? Kung mas mahal ang bilhin nila, mas malaki ang intermediate consumption, and therefore, ano mangyayari? Mas maliit ito. Di ba? Mas maliit yung GVA ratio. And therefore, mas maliit ang GVA. So hopefully, I'm impressing upon you the coolness of this thing. First of all, it's cool that we're trying to incorporate this, right? That we have to. That it's significant enough to include, right? And it's not insignificant for the United States. So that's why ManQ spends zero time about the underground economy. But in the Philippines, it's super important. And what I really haven't found yet in my research is sort of the size of this. So in the end, it's a GVA org, GVA on org. Ito yung computation niya for the GVA, okay? Which is sort of an average of the GVA org and the GVA on org. So when you're multiplying these two numbers together, it's sort of an average of them both. So sa Pilipinas, I would say, I want to know what this is. And I have not yet seen what this is. They have not, to my knowledge, released this. And I want to see how much of our GVA is in fact attributable according to this residual demand model. How much of, where is that residual demand model? How much of residual demand model here, how much of the residual employment approach is in fact of our GDP, how much is attributable to the non-organized. Okay, so that's where we're at. So we'll continue with our analysis here by thinking about GDP at constant and GDP at nominal. GDP constant and GDP nominal. And hopefully we can finish the Excel. Probably won't do this. Okay, let's jump directly. Oh, well, we'll do GDP nominal, GDP real in a moment. But first, let's continue doing the how does the PSA do it? So meron tayong production approach, right? We said, how do you know what GDP is? GDP is now the sum of gross value added for the informal and the informal, and then you're sort of averaging the GVAs, but you're adding all of that, right? So how do you know then the expenditure and income approach? Okay. So expenditure is determined using a commodity flow table or commodity flow approach. The commodity flow table uses retail and wholesale trade surveys, household income and expenditure surveys. Okay. So this is essentially the summary of the commodity approach. Kailangan mo na itong commodity flow table. On the left-hand side, you have the output. Ito siya, di ba? May gross output. You have output here. So you enter each industry, PSEC 5. Remember, you have a PSEC 5 estimate for each of these, and you're putting numbers in for gross output. Then what this does is based on supply and use tables, allocate the supply to domestic users or to intermediate consumption, or to other consumption categories like household final consumption. This will be done by type of products. Typically, these ratios will be based on past data to fill in these cells: investment, household final consumption, government final consumption, etc. And then these ratios will be based on past data, and it's based on that sum of the gross value added that we are going to fill in here in this first paragraph, first column, I should say. So this is an allocation. Meron kang total GDP or numbers per industry. You are allocating this to the different expenditure categories that we discussed earlier. Okay. And it has to be final consumption, as we said. So you have to also know which of this output is intermediate consumption from the point of view of consumers and which is final consumption from the point of view of consumers. That's why that distinction is still relevant here. Okay, so as for the income approach, so expenditure yon, the same idea goes for the income approach. Total production is distributed using the income and outlay accounts. Okay? This will distribute GDP to the income of factors. So meron kang labor, capital, etc., etc. So that's how the sausage is made generally. We only consume GDP from the news, but actually if you read through the technical notes, very interesting siya. And the Philippines has no choice really but to make these guesses and to use essentially the commodity flow data that they compile using other kinds of surveys, which sort of decompose the production of final goods here into the different consumption or the different income categories. Okay, so that's actually how it works. No one actually goes to a consumer and say, excuse me, final consumption mo ba to? Ganon. Walang, it's not that. We are doing it statistically with some, assumptions and some modeling and some, we're also asking them essentially, but we're not asking them all the time every year. Because a lot of these things are not annual. Some of these, like the FIES is like every 3-4 years, something like that, right? Yeah, you might know more when that is. Okay. So now I will show you guys some documents from the PSA. So these are some technical notes on the national accounts. And then you guys can download this. This is purely from the PSA. Iba-iba siyang quarter, but I just got one of the latest ones. It says here the different data sources that's used. This includes both for the yung GVA production and to allocate. And then here, expenditure approach, right? This is the methodology. This is how they do it with the assumption that sales of goods from retail trade is equal to the consumption of households. It also includes sales to other consumers, blah, blah, blah. So this paragraph here is basically a summary of yung supply and use tables that we were just talking about earlier. And same thing for government consumption, and so on and so forth. So there's they produce the total GDP and then they sort of assign them using these rules. All right. So that's this document. Quarterly and annual gross domestic product data, sources and methods. This is a PSA document as well. And I want to make sure you guys read this. Everything I'm talking about is from this document, but it would be a good idea to download this. General methods, the production approach, which we just talked about. This is exactly the one we talked about earlier, the GVA from the different industry J's. And that's the production approach. Anything else? I think that's it. Okay. So now, wow, I really want, let's just try this. Okay. Let's take this table here. If you were using this data, going to calculate GDP, ano ang gagawin mo? Let's say you had this data, and this is already the product of a lot of underlying research, and then someone gives this to you. How would you calculate GDP?
For every industry classified, you deduct the intermediate consumption from the output and sum all of them up to get the GDP.
Correct.
the industry.
Yeah, that's it. I'm glad everyone understood that. That's basically the point of this table, that at some point you will have these industries here, and then you will have the total output per industry, and then you have all of these consumption data, which are constructed, blah, 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 blah. And then at the end, you just 300 minus 50, and that's construction and repairs GVA. And then you do it for everything, and then you sum it up. And given only this information, that's how we do it. This one is sort of will help you. Let me just make it smaller. Help you. This is sort of like a processed supply and use table already and commodity flow table. Because these tables here show you, for example, the compensation of employees already, purchases of materials, consumption of capital, the imputed value of owner-occupied dwellings. So all of the things that we've been talking about in the supply and use tables, the assignments, they're all here. Okay. And this is how a table like this, for example, is how you might calculate household final consumption. And you use this table because this table essentially is already everything that you need to calculate. Kasi na-assign na siya from the GDP or from the GVA calculation which you had done here, right? And it also includes a lot of other information that's not included there because some of this is imputed nga and it's not part of the measurement from, say, ASPBI or CPPBI. We will skip this, but I heartily encourage you guys to calculate these two things, okay, using the data that's been provided. Okay. Now, other readings on Philippine measurement is Virola and Medalla and Handok. If there's time and interest, maybe we can do this. Super interesting stuff. Everything that we're going to study in the future is based on this GDP idea. Diba? And this GDP idea is contentious. And this is a debate between Virola and Medalla and Handok. Handok, by the way, is Carl Handok, back when he was a student. So nagka-paper sila talking about the expenditure approach to GDP and bakit parang weird yung data natin. Okay, now let's talk about real versus nominal. I really want to make sure we finish this, but I promise to end whatever in 5 minutes, okay? Real versus nominal GDP. Nominal GDP uses current period prices to value output. So you can see here, it's the sum of price times quantity. And you could also think about this as the sum of GVAs. But the important thing that we want to focus in on now is the value of the price, how to value it. Right? This is the current market price that you're valuing it. And that makes it a nominal GDP. So real GDP is when we fix price time periods to a base year B. So it's an arbitrary, you can have any base year B. And then our GDP is basically the following. Price for good or product or sector I, okay, base year times the output of sector I in year T, because that's the real GDP in year T. So pansinin mo, the difference between this equation and this is the B, right? The price, right? The price vector. So you can imagine the prices, it's a vector or a list of prices. This will be the prices in the base year, and this will be the prices in the current year. Now, we define a GDP deflator as just the ratio between NGDP and real GDP. So how do we calculate GDP in practice? We will get to that in a moment. Now, GDP versus GNP. So GDP is the value of products and services produced within a country in a given time period. GNP is GDP plus factor payments from abroad minus factor payments to abroad. So this basically defines the difference between GDP and GNP. If GDP is the value of final products and services produced within a country in a time period, what is GNP? GNP then is the value of products and services by residents of a nation or economy. So kailangan, it need not be produced in the Philippines. It need not be produced in the Philippines as long as it's by residents of the Philippines abroad. Okay. So an example in ManQ is, for example, if a Japanese person owns a house in America, you would pay rent to the Japanese person, and you would subtract that rent from here, payments to abroad. So GNP is lower by that amount because the factor payments go to a Japanese person, even though the rental happened in the United States and it would go into GDP, right? Because GDP doesn't care about the ownership or the citizenship of the factors of production. It cares only about whether the output was produced within that country. So that's why there's a difference, right? So GNP is all about the identity of the factors of the production, right? So it has to be the value of products and services by residents of a particular nation or economy. So to you guys, what would cause the difference for the Philippines between GDP and GNP? Wow, something to think about. Okay. Something to think about. Okay, so anyway, I'll ask that question again next week, and I expect an answer. So think about this in the Philippine context. What is the significance of this difference? Okay. You can even look up actual Philippine data for GDP versus GNP and tell me. Next, Philippine rebasing. So every so often, nagre-rebase ang GDP natin. So we, of course, always calculate GDP. But over time, nagbabago yung base year. Okay? So bakit kailangan magbago yung base year? So first, dahil nasa batas. But economically, the important thing here is the last one. Regular updating of base year is necessary to capture changes in the economy, consumer behavior, statistical developments, and changes in user needs, particularly for this class, for the macro class. You want to be able to capture changes in the economy. So what would happen if PIB here is like 20 years old, 30 years old, right? So these are really old prices, and these prices are used to value current consumption. You can see intuitively that that would make it out of whack, right? That would change definitely the value of these goods and services, that sort of reflecting 2023. If this were like 1980 or 1990 even. In particular, some products before, like 30 years ago, were very expensive, but now could be very, very cheap. So that means you're valuing those products incorrectly, or the opposite could be happening. That before that is very cheap and now it's very expensive. And so the current nominal GDP or current real GDP would also be out of whack. So you'd want to be able to change the base year because it would capture these changes in the economy, because essentially those prices are weights. The thing that real GDP is the thing that you're interested in. Real GDP is what we really want. We want to know how much we're producing. But we want to be able to weight the outputs, the final goods outputs, by the correct weights. And we want to use a base year that's closer to the current year. We don't want to use nominal GDP all the time because we want to separate Q from P. And like we said from the earlier, sorry, I did not get your name, earlier person who asked the question, paano kung nagtataas yung presyo pero yung quantity doesn't change? That will come out as a change in nominal GDP, but in real GDP, it won't matter, right? It won't change because the prices by definition are constant. Okay, so that's the difference between NGDP in that example and real GDP. And from our perspective as an economist, we are more interested in this because really we're interested in the Q and not the P's. The P's are only there to weight the Q's in importance and to give them value, like in pesos.
Pero pwede bang magtanong?
Go ahead.
Yung sa change po ng base year, hindi po ba mas okay kung every year po papalitan or depende po kung ano talaga yung pinaka-closer doon sa price?
Well, kung every year siyang papalitan, basically nominal na lang siya. Kasi every year, nagbabago ang price. So if you look at this, every year nagbabago yung ang price. Okay? And then every time you change the base year, I think that was your idea, right? If you change the base year every year, the entire GDP series will change every year. So in a sense, that's not what you really want, because what you want is a consistent series for real GDP to focus on Q. And if the base year is always changing, then that's it's almost as if it's just you're comparing NGDP. So it's impossible to judge if the Qs are going up or the Ps are the ones that's going up. Remember, that's the whole idea of real GDP. Ano ba ang umaakyat? Yung Q or yung P times Q? And real GDP is supposed to help us answer that. It's supposed to say, yung Q yung tumaas. Or yung Q bumaba kahit na tumaas yung P. Yan. And
May ideal po bang like age, like 5 to 10 years na mas maganda yung base year or wala naman?
meron po. In the United States, every 5 years sila before. So before chain weights, and we'll be talking about chain weights next week, and rebasement na rin kasi there's no more time. Every 5 years, nagbabago yung base year. Sa Pilipinas, dapat every 5 years, pero as usual, hindi nangyayari. And the latest rebasement was in 2018. Oh, guess what? It's 2023. So dapat nag-base year rebasement na sila at this point. They're probably planning a rebasement this year. So probably in the next 2 to 3 years, you'll see, we rebased the 2023 data, but nalalabas siya in 2025. Yun, probably. Hopefully. Okay, gusto ko sanang gawin tong rebasement, but let's be fair to ourselves. 3:55 na. I will start here next week. I want everyone to look at this, and I will not use this as a homework anymore because we cannot actually use it as homework because we weren't able to finish it. But please look at the formulas and to figure out what this thing is all about. But this is all about rebasing and what the effects of rebasing are. And then we'll start from there, and then we'll go ahead with chain weights. And then let me just preview chain weights. And then we'll talk about the composition of GDP. We'll be talking about this. This is a mathematical topic. And then consumer price index. And then we'll talk about employment. And then by next week, we should be done with, we'll end up with a model next week. So we'll definitely spend a lot of time in class talking. So hopefully the first hour and a half will be the end of lecture 1, and then another hour and a half for national income. What is the national income, quote unquote. All right, thank you, and I look forward to meeting everyone again next week. Sa mga people who don't have UVLE yet, please email me by Thursday if you still don't have the UVLE, and make sure by Thursday you have the homework. Kasi I'll be doing it tonight or tomorrow morning. So by Thursday, dapat meron na kayong access sa UVLE. If not, just email me and I'll send you the homework. Okay? Maraming salamat. And that's it. Any questions?